Hi everyone, I'm Lauren and I recently turned 30 years old. To celebrate, I thought I would find 30 books that I have loved the most, found very important, or the most influential across my life. So I have found 30, I think. I have counted them a couple of times, and I'm going to rattle through them with you today. These are all books I've loved. Some of them are from when I was a child, some of them are from very recently, and there's a range of reasons I've included all of them in here. So in no particular order whatsoever, I'll start with Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I read this at the end of last year because it was the pick for our Feminist Orchestra book club, and what a good pick. I absolutely loved it. This is the story of Dana, who is a black woman living in the 1970s in the US, who intermittently begins time travelling back to slave era Maryland, where she finds out that she's related to one of the plantation owners. What I absolutely loved about this book is how visceral it was, how realistic, which means horrific in many parts when you're dealing with aspects of slavery, but it really merged the idea of this, I guess, science fiction fantasy type of book with her time travelling and everybody just accepting it, but it felt like more of a historical fiction novel, and also a thriller, because you're so terrified for Dana. A lot of the time it's a very unsafe world that she finds herself in, and I felt the mix of all of those aspects made it such an amazing, interesting and unputdownable read. I was really engrossed in it. Next we have Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This was the first Sarah Waters book that I read, and it remains, along with The Night Watch, it remains one of my favourites of hers. I have never been so taken into a book and at the same time completely shocked and surprised by all the twists and turns that happen in it. On top of that, the characters I feel are so well formed, so fully formed. I really felt for them and was totally engrossed in the story as well. And I love the way that Sarah Waters writes historical fiction, not only because she always has the kind of LGBT spin on it, but it feels modern and it feels like these are real people you could relate to without it feeling anachronistic. A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride. This is probably one of my favourite books ever. I still think about it a lot now. I found it so moving. And actually, I haven't reread it, which I probably should do because it's not very long, but it's very interesting the way it's written. This is about a young girl. It's sort of the story of her growing up and her relationship with her brother, who has learning difficulties, also her relationship with her mother, but also older men and various nefarious people in her life. But what's interesting is the way that it's written, and to me, this is the closest I have ever found of somebody writing a stream of consciousness which really feels like you're inside the person's head, which makes it quite difficult to read. There's lots of half sentences, there's lots of repeated sentences and ideas, and the structure isn't very straightforward. It does jump around a lot, but for me that helped me really connect with the narrator's voice and really feel for her. And at the end of it, this is one of those, I'm like Joey on Friends having to put the book in the fridge. I was absolutely distraught at the end of this book, and had to go and ask Will for a hug because I was like, I'm so sad. This book's made me so sad. I had a good think about which Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie I wanted to feature in this video, but I decided to go with Half of a Yellow Sun, which is the first of her books that I ever read. I did really enjoy Americana, and Purple Hibiscus as well, but for me, I think this is my favourite, and I read it so long ago, and therefore it affected me more because I was younger when I read it. This book follows how the Nigerian Civil War affects different members of a family and the kind of extended family. There's lots of people in different social classes in Nigeria. There's a journalist over there, and it's looking at how dreadful it was and how it affected everybody. At the time when I read it, I knew absolutely nothing about Nigeria's history, and this was the book that really made me fall in love with her writing, so I have to have a special place in my heart for it because of that. Now let's jump back to childhood, shall we? And I've got a trilogy here which kind of gets my numbers up quite quickly, and that is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. I absolutely loved this series when it came out, when I guess, how old was I? Maybe early teens. I was completely besotted by Lyra, the main character in this book. I also loved the idea of having a demon. I mean, I think everybody likes this concept of something external to you, which is your soul or is your personality or really defines your personality. This is one of the reasons I think everybody loves Harry Potter so much. Like, the concept of having a house, people love it. And I found that very interesting about these books. I loved the concept of the different worlds, and you know, that as somebody who isn't religious themselves, this kind of idea of what life is and what life should mean, and sort of railing against the concept of organised religion, I suppose, really spoke to me at the time. I reread these books, I think a year or two ago, and I loved them just as much as an adult as I did when I was a child. I found it so utterly magical. Anna Karenina is one of the favourite books I've ever read. I've read it a couple of times now, and I also did a page to screen episode on it, so I got to watch lots of different adaptations of it as well, which took a long time, let me tell you. And what I found that pulled me into this book is the characters. I found them so realistic and fully formed. I really identified with a lot of them, and what I enjoy is a book which is long and a little bit slow, perhaps a little bit meandering in parts, but it means you can really get your teeth into the story and get to know the characters sort of at your own pace. Everyone calls it a tragic love story. I mean, to be fair, Anna and Vronsky, I could give or take. I'm not that interested with them, but Levin and Kitty, I would give my life for. I'm so invested in their story. I haven't read War and Peace. I did try and read War and Peace, and I got not very far through, and there were so many descriptions of battles that I just couldn't understand that I put it down. But whenever I think of how much I love Tolstoy's writing in Anna Karenina, it does make me want to give War and Peace another go. I think perhaps I could even get through the battles if I could find a story I loved as much as this one. The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss has been one of my favourite books for a long time. I don't have it because I've lent it to my friend, because I just think everybody should read it. I've since read a lot more of Sarah Moss's work, and I still think this is one of my favourites by her. I did really enjoy Ghost Wall, which came out last year, but for me the Tidal Zone is just incredible and everything I think that I wanted in a book, basically. The story itself is focusing on a teenage girl, Miriam, who collapses one day at school and her heart just stops beating and nobody can work out why. So she goes to the hospital, the doctors do lots of tests, and they don't really understand what happened or if it could happen again. But we're seeing this perspective from her father, who's also a historian and at the same time is researching Coventry during the Second World War and the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral. So it's really looking at how close we are to death at any point, really, like the transience of life and how disaster can strike without us being prepared. I found her language and her writing really beautiful as well, and I enjoyed these kind of philosophical ruminations, and also Miriam is an absolute badass feminist, so that always helps. Another book that I did read a long while ago, but I still feel its pull over me, and that is What I Loved by Siri Husvet. This was the first Siri Husvet I read, and I think I'm seeing a theme here that when I find an author that I really like, it's always their first work, which I guess I look at really fondly. As in many or most of Siri Husvet's works of fiction, a lot of the characters in here are artists, and I really enjoy how she describes the art exhibitions they're putting on. Sometimes I just want to see this exhibition myself. I'm so intrigued by it. But the plot revolves around two couples who both have sons about the same age, and then it's what happens when one of them dies. It's very sad, it's very poignant, it's very beautiful, but it's also looking at kind of the nature of people. I would really like to read it again, actually, because it was a long while ago that I read it, because she is such an intelligent person and she writes books of essays which I've really enjoyed as well. And I just like hearing her opinions and her ideas, basically, whether they're in non-fiction or in fiction form. Now, a pair of books that I've read incredibly recently, which just goes to show how much I love them, that I'm including them in this roundup, wrap-up, review, whatever it is, and that is Max Porter's two books, Grief is a Thing with Feathers and Lanny. I am just absolutely in love with Max Porter's writing, essentially, and I think what he's done in both of these books, structurally and poetically and with his language and his storytelling, I think is incredible. He also knows how to pack an emotional punch as well. I will give him that. When I was going through all these books that I wanted to include, I realised anything kind of to do with families and children, I generally made me cry, so perhaps I'm just a very emotional person, and you know, Max Porter knows how to speak to me. But Grief is a Thing with Feathers is about a father and two sons, and the mother dies, and it's about them going through their grief, and we get a series of poems, some from Dad's perspective, some from the boy's perspective, and some from the perspective of Crow, which is a manifestation of their grief in this odd abstract form. And then Lanny is about an odd little boy, I suppose, who lives in a village with his mum and dad, and there's an old guy called Pete who is an artist, and it's about him going missing. So again, we get perspectives from mum, from dad, from Pete, and this odd abstract creature like a green man type presence called Dead Puffer Toothwort. Honestly, it was such a roller coaster reading this book. So I would highly recommend both of them because I think his language is incredible. Moving on to some non-fiction, I used to be a little bit scared of kind of Virginia Woolf's work. I had tried to read Mrs. Dalloway when I was younger and found it quite difficult, but then when I read A Room of One's Own, I found not only that, perhaps being a little bit older as well, I really kind of got in with her writing and I liked what she was saying, but I also found how much I loved reading essays, and I don't think I'd really got into reading that kind of non-fiction before. A Room of One's Own is an extrapolation on a speech that Virginia Woolf gave about why we don't have any women geniuses, essentially, women writers who are so revered at the time when she was speaking. And what she says is what you need to be able to write or to be creative is means, as in an income, and a room of one's own in which to write. And what she then sort of goes on to argue is that many women weren't able to have that, and that this is a societal, a structural, logistical reason, essentially, why more women aren't writing amazing genius novels, is because they're unable to, not because men are just better suited to it. I remember reading it and just being so like, yes, oh my gosh, this is so correct. And not only did it speak to my little feminist heart, but also it made me not scared of reading more on this topic, but from a more historical perspective instead of gravitating towards more modern books. However, speaking of those more modern books, considering we're on the subject, the first book that I read that really spoke to me about gender and kind of societal structures from a modern perspective, and not just saying women should be paid more at work, which are like, obviously, is Girls Will Be Girls by Emma O'Toole. And what she's really looking at here isn't just women. I think something about the book that I would change is that she assumes you're a woman reading this book, which I think does it a little bit of a disservice, because she's not looking at women, she's looking at gender and the construct of gender, and how it's all performative in all senses, not just the way you dress or the way you look, the way you walk, the way you act. And that's as true for men as it is for women, or on whatever kind of gender scale you see yourself. Like, the idea of masculinity and femininity, it is just the way we outwardly perform ourselves. And I found it so easy to read. And I think actually, if you're kind of intrigued by reading around the topic of gender, but are quite put off about it being too academic or too historic or too, I guess, soapboxy, potentially, I think this is a really good one to pick up to see if it's something that piques your interest. Now, a book I don't think I've really spoken enough about, because I really, really enjoyed it at the time, and I think it's one of those books that I know in my head, like, I loved this book, but I don't think I've really promoted it enough, so it's time to change that, and that's Sweet Home by Carys Bray. This is a collection of short stories that she wrote before her novels, so A Song for Issy Bradley, which I actually haven't read yet and would love to, and The Museum of You. And perhaps it's her writing, which I love, again, but perhaps it's also the topics that she's dealing with in here, which we have learnt is my heart really leans towards children and families and things. A lot of the stories in here are really focusing on sort of the heartbreak of losing children, or wanting children, not being able to have them, or losing a lost love. It's very much looking at families, which is, you know, the concept of it being home and that place at home. And I think it's rare when you read a short story collection that you love every single story in it, and that's how I felt with this collection, which is why it's included in this list, because it's not just there was a couple of stories in there that really spoke to me. It was like story after story I was just completely taken aback by. I always like to feel like I liked Elena Ferrante like before she was famous, before she was big on BookTube, which is a complete lie, because the Neapolitan novels have been around for a long time. But I first read Days of Abandonment by her, kind of before I'd even heard of the Neapolitan novels, and before a lot of people in BookTube were really reading them. And to be honest, I didn't really like the Neapolitan novels, but Days of Abandonment, I completely loved. This is about a woman whose husband leaves her for a younger woman, and it's just about her getting over that. Basically, the book itself is just that time after he's abandoned her and how she's dealing with it. I really enjoyed her writing in this book. I do generally really like her shorter novellas, just because I think she says more in fewer lines and in fewer words than in the Neapolitan novels, which I feel like just drag personally. So I think if you'd tried those books and didn't like it, which I know a lot of people have, I would still really recommend giving this a go. I think this is my favourite of her standalone novels that I've read. I'm going to go a bit rogue here and mention a book which I wouldn't recommend to anybody necessarily now, but a book that at the time was quite instructive to me in terms of what I like in literature, and now in hindsight teaches me something very different, and that's Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I never now include this on a list of my favourite books, but when I first read it, which I think I was like 17, 18 when I first read it, I think this was the first time I'd really read a classic book, or an older book I suppose, which was so long and so that went through over so many years of somebody's life, and that I felt like I really understood all the characters, and I felt like I was really interested in it, and I kept going with the book. And I think when you're a little bit younger, you're used to reading faster paced, younger focused books, and kind of more classic works don't really appeal to you. So this is the first time that I really felt like I got into something. I read it a couple of times in that short period and saw the film and everything, and it's interesting, isn't it, how when you're young and white and don't really have that kind of perspective, especially in the US of slavery, you don't really realise how racist something's being. And not that you don't realise that the characters are racist, because you do, but what I mean is, I don't think I realised when I first read it how the book itself structurally was kind of advocating slavery as a way of life, and how the black characters were written. And it's interesting to me now that I was able to read it and it not affect me in the same way as if, a book that was written a long time ago was very sexist. I would be the first one to say, well, I know it's of its time, but this is very sexist the way this character's written. And it, obviously now that I'm older, you sort of look back and think, that was very, very easy for me to ignore the racism aspect, because it's not something that affects me personally. And the reason I've included it in this list now is because I think it's been influential in a couple of ways, really, not just in terms of the type of writing, excluding what the writing's about, and me enjoying the book when I first read it, but also a lesson in reading something critically and not just seeing what the characters are doing, but unpacking what the author is doing as well, which is quite an interesting lesson, which I'm glad I've learned. Again, I really struggled which Ali Smith to include in this list, and the one I really wanted to include was The Accidental, which I don't have a copy of, but funnily enough was the first book I read by her, which I absolutely adored. And I think it's difficult when you really like an author and you like their writing to choose which book you would define your love for them. So I wanted to include The Accidental just for my own history, but also what I'm loving at the moment is no surprise is her Seasons quartet. I'm including each of these books, so that's 4 Ali Smith gets on this list, but I couldn't choose one of these because it's not really about the specific book, it's about the series, and it's about what she's doing over these 4 years, which I just find astonishing. So if you're not aware, she's writing a book a year, and each book, they're not linked plot wise, but they're just about what's happening in the world, and primarily from a UK's perspective, I guess. And it's like she's writing about the now through these different stories and these different characters, and it's incredible. And the more you read as it goes on through the series, the more you see what she's doing and what she's creating. Jacqueline Wilson was incredibly influential to me growing up, and the 2 books of hers that I loved the absolute most was Double Act and The Lottie Project. And what I really loved about her books in general was that she, to me, as a 10-year-old girl, I felt like it was someone my age writing. Like, I really identified with the characters and their dreams and the way they understood their world. But what I loved most about these two books is that they're very clearly people writing, which I used to like doing when I was young, writing little stories and writing little diaries. In Double Act, you've got the two sisters writing in slightly different fonts, so you can kind of see who's writing and how their lives are unfolding there. And in the Lottie project, you have Charlie, who's writing a historical diary as part of her homework project on the Victorians, which again would have been part of my dream assignment. Like, all of my homework, like from that age, is me imagining I was a person in Roman times and getting really involved in what was happening and creating all these characters. So the Lottie project was just, that was my book. Like, that's who I was. So I feel like those two books in particular really encapsulate my childhood and also my relationship with books and reading and writing. This is such an odd order I'm doing these books in. It's just very ad hoc, and I'm thinking the books I have left are a little bit, I don't know why they're last, but there we go, that's what we're doing. So the next book I have is Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine, which I read last year. And I think, considering over the last maybe 3 years, I've been kind of upping the feminist / gender studies non-fiction that I've been reading. I think this was just an incredible one, and not something that I would have picked up a few years ago as well, which makes me feel quite happy. This is very, very scientific based, and what Cordelia Fine is doing is not just looking at gender as a construct in society, but she's actually looking at the science and the studies that have been done on male and female brains to work out, is there really a difference? And if there is a difference in how your brain functions, fine, how does that mean that your minds are different necessarily? And I found it completely fascinating. I really felt like I was in a lecture at university because she was so informative and so engaging, and then also kind of peppering it with little anecdotes from her own life. But not too much. Like, it felt very, it didn't feel like she was being self-indulgent, and I just really loved it, considering I have no background in neuroscience or anything that scientific. I felt it's so easy to read and understand as well. A book that I did hear a lot about and had a lot of hype surrounding it, which I also really loved and then was pushing into all my friends and family's hands at Christmas, was Homegoing by Yardie Jessie. This is a really interesting look at the history of slavery, I suppose, but the way that she takes this history is that she jumps generations between two sisters. There's two sisters in Ghana, the Gold Coast, as it was in Africa. One of them gets sold into slavery and the other one doesn't. And each chapter, you're sort of jumping between the descendants of each of the sisters. So it's quite, you jump around a lot. And I think some of the criticism of the book is that you don't get to spend a lot of time with each character, because each chapter you've kind of jumped a complete generation. But I really loved that as a sort of, I guess, a potted history, but also you're sort of seeing the macro environments and how they change. And what is really heartbreaking is because you've seen the history and you've been there through each generation, but the branch of the family that does get sold into slavery and ends up in the United States, once you get to modern times, they don't have very much information at all about where they came from. There's only a couple of generations, and then several times the history or the story or the knowledge will be lost, like on more than one occasion. It will just be broken and there'll be no information about where they came from. And I found that aspect of it a really interesting perspective, because it really brought home that this pain kind of continued throughout the generations, and this family have been robbed again and again and again, subsequent generations, of themselves and of their own history. It's not just the people that it happened to, the people who were taken from their home and subject to slavery and torture and all of the rest of it. Like, even now, throughout the generations, the effects are still rippling. Someone I've not spoken about yet is Margaret Atwood, and this was quite difficult again for me to choose which book had the most effect on me. I think typically people would say The Handmaid's Tale. I think my favourite of hers is The Blind Assassin. And again, I think this was influential for me because her writing style was something I hadn't come across before. I read Alias Grace and The Blind Assassin in quite close succession, and it was getting into that rhythm of having quite long, not really split up into chapters, quite long sections, language which is quite interesting and poetic in some ways. And I just think The Blind Assassin for me I particularly really liked. It's about kind of a woman whose sister is famously wrote this book, The Blind Assassin, and her sister died a long while ago and is revered as this amazing author. And you're seeing sort of clips, history of their life together, a little bit of the sister now, and also little excerpts from the book The Blind Assassin as well. So I really liked how it chopped and changed and all came together at the end. And it's interesting actually, because some of the books on this list are from very recently, because I know now the kind of writing I enjoy reading, because I read a lot more, I'm a little bit older, and also I talk about books very regularly and speak to people who are reading the same thing as me. So I think I've really refined my own taste and formulated what I enjoy, and it's quite interesting to look back on the books that were influential, that helped me get there, I suppose, and I think The Blind Assassin is one of those. And what a beautiful seamless segue that is into a book which came out fairly recently and I just knew I loved and was blown away by, and that's Stay With Me by Adebayor, which was robbed of the Women's Prize for Fiction the other year, 2017. I was the Power won that year, and I'm still not over it. The novel starts with a couple who are recently married and unable to have children, or they haven't had children yet at least. So the husband's family are pressuring him to take on a second wife in order to father some children. And as a premise you think, oh okay, interesting, let's see how this goes. But the story itself takes twists and turns which I wasn't expecting. You think it's quite a straightforward premise, but she takes you on such a journey, and it's not just through these individual characters and the plot of their own story. She's also looking at wider themes of motherhood and family and sisterhood really as well, and daughters and sort of growing up. There's lots of fairy tale elements in there, and I think what impressed me most about the book is not just, oh I love the story, I love the characters or whatever. I just feel like the way she structured it seems so effortless, and there were so many different little themes and things going on in it. But it didn't detract from the plot as well. She kind of meshed those things together so well, and I absolutely loved it. And, you know, should have won. And we're going to end on a classic, just because I had to include it, and that's Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Again, a nice set of 3, gets me up to 30 very easily. I just love this series. I'm going to put it down because these are actually quite heavy, these books. It's partly to do with the age when I read them and the age I was when the films came out, because I wouldn't actually say Tolkien's writing in and of itself is really that amazing. It's not very, I mean, you don't go to Lord of the Rings for the literature, you go there for the story and for the characters and for this world, and it's just a world that I love and I've always loved, and I feel so at home in it, and I love when I reread those books because it really brings me back to that time. A lot of you will know that every year at Christmas time, me and my friends from school sit down and have a Lord of the Rings marathon, normally overnight for some reason, even though we are far too old to be doing that now. But we do it every year, and you know, the Saturday before Christmas is Lord of the Rings night, always, and we've done it for like nearly 15 years now, and you know, it's just something that's really special to me and feels really homely to me. A lot of people I know feel this way about Harry Potter, and for me that's Lord of the Rings. So how long is this video? I don't know, probably far too long. I'm trying to get through 30 books that I've loved or have been otherwise influential in some other way. I'd love to hear from you if you've read them. I'd love to hear what your favourite books of all time are. What are the books that have been so influential to you? What are the books that maybe you should probably get over but you can't just because you read them at that right age, and you know, you're going to love it forever now. I'd love to keep talking in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!